At this point, I've done videos reciting excerpts from chapters 1 and 2 of the Lotus Sutra, and soon I'll be reciting excerpts from chapter 3, specifically the parable within that chapter. But before embarking on that project, I thought I would briefly indicate some of the content from the Hurvitz description of chapters 1, 2, and 3 in his preface to his translation of the Lotus Sutra. Relative to chapter 1, he says, as the scene opens, the Buddha has just entered a state of concentration, or samadhi. And what you'll recall there is that the state of concentration that he entered into was a meditation on the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, which previously I had made videos reciting key portions of that wonderful sutra, and you can reference back to that if you're interested. So while in this state of concentration, the Buddha emits from between the brows a ray of light that illuminates the entire universe. And of course, this again is a miraculous kind of development that astonishes and delights the huge assembly surrounding him. And what happens then is Manjusri, asked by Maitreya what is the cause of this, replies that the Buddha is indicating by this ray of light that he is about to preach the Lotus Sutra. So what you have is Maitreya, who is the bodhisattva who represents symbolically the figure who is predicted to be the next Buddha in our Saha world, in the earth that we live in. And anyway, he's considered to be kind of in a learning mode, is how I read him. And so he's asking Manjusri, this more senior bodhisattva, who represents infinite wisdom and who's been around for a long, long time, apparently. He says, what's the story on this ray that came out of the Buddha's brow, or out of the Buddha's forehead? And again, after a long description by Maitreya of what he is able to see as a function of this ray, namely myriad bodhisattvas performing functions in a variety of ways consistent with the bodhisattva practices and path, as well as a variety of beings engaged in various devotional activities that the Buddha says are sufficient for them to attain Buddhahood. Anyhow, he sees all these things, and these are described, but ultimately Manjusri responds to Maitreya's query, and basically what he says, the bottom line, is that he was around a long, long time ago, eons prior to this miraculous event, and he saw another Buddha who likewise had a ray come out of his forehead in a state of concentration. And what the implication was at that time was that what was about to happen was that the Buddha was preparing to preach the Lotus Sutra. So then in chapter 2, which is really a key chapter within the Lotus Sutra, Hurvitz says, emerging from his concentration, the Buddha tells his listeners that there is only one path to salvation, not three, and that every Buddha who makes his appearance in the world does so for the sole purpose of teaching this truth to the beings. Now, if you're familiar with Buddhism, you'll recognize that these three paths represent the Sravakas, who are the hearers, and then the Pratyeka Buddhas, who are individuals who attain a kind of wisdom in isolation on their own, and then the Bodhisattvas, which is really the path that the Buddha is touting in many ways as superior within this Lotus Sutra, who altruistically make a vow to forego their own enlightenment until they can help all suffering beings transcend their suffering and themselves attain salvation or enlightenment. So the whole notion within that chapter again is tactfulness or skillful means, that the Buddha taught the three paths earlier in his career, but that now on the verge of entering his final nirvana or extinction, he's about to teach, he does teach in this sutra, the ultimate truth, which is that all these various vehicles, or all these various types of teaching, are really for the sake of the one vehicle, and they're only tactful methods or provisional teachings designed to be consistent with the mentalities, the personalities, the spiritual needs of particular individuals or groups of individuals, and that those don't necessarily represent the ultimate teaching, which he is now giving forth in the form of the one Buddha vehicle. You know, in a lot of ways, this can be translated in the context of there being a variety of spiritual paths that humans can pursue, different religions, different denominations within religions, different approaches within a given denomination, different generic approaches independent of any particular doctrine or religion, and yet what this chapter is saying is that, again, the Buddha's technique is to provide all these, quote, 84,000 ways. This is typically the number that gets quoted in Buddhist literature, but that they're all really leading to the same place. They're all leading to the insights associated with wisdom and compassion. Wisdom, again, being that sense we can experience of being interconnected and not separate from our fellow beings, and compassion being the natural result of that insight. So then this does create some confusion, because again, in the context of the historical establishment of the Lotus Sutra around 100 or so AD, this was a teaching that was not consistent with the earlier teachings within Buddhism, within the Pali Canon in particular. And so much of the sutra here at this stage is being preached to Shariputra, who's a representative of that earlier form of teaching. He was a disciple of the Buddha, and has attained some of the goals that are articulated within that earlier form of Buddhism. So anyhow, in this particular chapter, chapter 3, the Buddha does predict to Shariputra that he will become a Buddha. And that's a different goal than, again, what had previously been put forward, which was more the goal to become an arhat, or a being that freed himself or herself from attachments and attained the state of nirvana. So, as Hurvitz says, the Buddha now prophesies to his disciple Sariputra the latter's future attainment of Buddhahood. Sariputra, though encouraged by this prophecy, still wishes to know why, if there are not three paths to salvation, the Buddha has so often preached their existence in the past. The Buddha replies with a parable. And when I do the recitation of chapter 3, the excerpts I'll select actually will be that parable. I will skip over the portion where Sariputra is given his prophecy, and also where it's described all the negative things that would happen to anybody that sort of blasphemes this sutra, because this sutra is considered to be something to be greatly revered and honored. The way Hurvitz describes the parable in brief is that a rich man had a very large house. The house had only one entrance, and the timber of which it was made had dried out thoroughly over the years. One day the house caught fire, and the rich man's many children, heedless of the fire, continued to play in the house. Their father called to them from outside that the house was afire, and that they would perish in the flames if they did not come out. The children, not knowing the meaning of, quote, fire or perish, continued to play as before. The man called out once more, "Come out, children, and I will give you ox-drawn carriages, goat-drawn carriages, and deer-drawn carriages." Tempted by the desire for new playthings, the children left the burning house, only to find a single great ox-drawn carriage awaiting them. So then, as Hurvitz says, asked whether the father can be rightly accused of having deceived his children, Shariputra says that he cannot, since he was merely employing a device to save their lives. Just so, says the Buddha, the world is a great house of fire with the flame of passion. When taught the way to Buddhahood, the beings, not understanding what is meant, remain in the passion trap. Then the Buddha, in order to rescue them, devises a scheme. The scheme is the doctrine of the three paths to salvation. So just as the father cannot be accused of having deceived his children, so the Buddha cannot be accused of deceiving the beings with this doctrine, although in the ultimate sense, the doctrine is not true. So again, this is a description through parable of the dynamic of skillful means that is pretty explicitly described in chapter 2. Actually, my understanding is that, this use of expedient means or tactful methods to some extent has stimulated some controversy, in the sense it is basically justifying telling lies or telling things that are not ultimately true. But what the authors of the Lotus Sutra are saying is that this is justified to the extent that it's really leading the spiritual seeker by means of methods that he or she can relate to toward an ultimate approach that represents one of being able to attain supreme enlightenment or Buddhahood.